All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm happy to welcome Patrick Cockburn back to the show. He's Middle East correspondent for The Independent. Of course, he's the author of quite a few books. I believe the latest is Muqtada al-Sadr, the Shia revival, and the struggle for Iraq a couple of years back. Excellent and important for the future struggle of Iraq as well. Welcome back to the show, Patrick. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
All right, now, do I understand right? You've been spending time in Damascus, Syria lately.
That's right, yeah, I got back last week.
Got back last week. Okay, so I guess, well, let's start with the massacre, because, of course, the way this is being played out, the Houla massacre, I don't know if that's how you say it, the way it's being played in the media here is that, we might just, even though we really, really don't want to, Western powers might have to escalate their intervention in Syria in reaction to this. It's sort of their little, junior Gulf of Tonkin type event, it seems. And yet, at the same time, it seems like what really happened there was in question, where first it was all blamed on artillery bombardment, and then it was shown that people were killed at close range. So the way I understood it, at least, only then was the pro-government militia invented that came in and must have done the work. And then, of course, the Ba'athist side of the story is that, no, the terrorists did it, of course, and they didn't do anything. So please give us your take on that before we get into the rest of the bigger picture here, please.
I think the evidence is that that the killings were carried out by the Shia, which is a pro-government militia. They're mostly Alawites. Houla is it's a series of villages in sort of central Syria, which are Sunni, and they're surrounded by villages that are Alawite and Shia, and some Christian villages too. There's quite a lot of fighting around there. Houla is a anti-government center. There was also a sort of, I think what came into it was sort of sectarian vendettas, that on the morning of on the Friday, when it was 2 weeks ago now, 10 days ago, that there was a protest there. The government fired with artillery. The men sort of attacked the checkpoints around. Then, while this was happening, these militia moved into the villages, and particularly sort of some of the houses there, and started this sort of sectarian slaughter. Now, it said, it's difficult to verify this particular bit, but I've heard from various sources that the villagers in Houla were blamed by the Alawites that somebody, an Alawite, prominent Alawite, had been killed. Another story is that in one Alawite village, or 12 people been killed in another village. So when they sort of moved into massacre, they were ringing up relatives saying, we are getting revenge, and so forth. So this was a sort of partly, a struggle between pro and anti-government, but also it was very much a sectarian struggle, I think. Massacre, like we used to see so often in Lebanon in the past.
Now, Bloomberg News is reporting that the Syrians are saying that these are people who had refused to give in to the rebels' demands, and that included a guy who was a candidate in the recent elections who had been a pro-government candidate, and that was supposed to be the proof that it was pro-regime families and people who refused to go along with the rebels who were the ones who were targeted in this case. Is that not credible to you?
Not really. They've produced this story sort of very late in the day. I think it's much more likely that it was Alawite villagers who did it. And I don't see, this is a Sunni area. Would they be massacred by Sunni? This is all the sort of signs of sort of, brutal sectarian killing, not just people who, you might have a gun battle, but this sort of killing is usually sort of part of sectarian vendettas. So I don't. It's difficult to prove or disprove these things, but I think it's very unlikely.
All right. Well, now this is really the tone of this article here. Why war is marching on the road to Damascus in the Independent. Well, it starts. It's a city. It feels like a city expecting the worst to happen, and by the worst, that means sectarian war. And you talk about how people are still trying to make it just the people versus the government, at least in their own mind, but that ultimately this really is already breaking down along sectarian lines. You say it reminds you of Beirut at the start of their 15-year civil war. Oh, Patrick, say it ain't so. Come on.
Sure, no, it's very, it's unfortunate. The atmosphere is very much like that. And, the ingredients are something like that. That you have a breakup of the state, you have sectarian tensions, but also you have within Syria the different parties, the different groups, the different sects, all with their sponsors and patrons outside the country who will supply them with money and weapons. And that, again, makes it even more difficult to end the conflict. After all, one major, part of what's happening in Syria is a genuine popular uprising against a police state. But part of it also is a war of the Sunni against the Shia, which has been going on since the Iranian Revolution. It's led by Saudi Arabia within the area, and the U.S. With Saudi Arabia within the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, as you might imagine, is one of the most sort of absolute monarchies in the world. Is not that interested in spreading democracy and civil rights to the Syrian people, but it is very interested in the Sunni taking over there from the Alawites, who are a sort of Shia sect, and they're also interested in removing Iran's main ally, which is Syria and the Arab world, which also the U.S. wants to do. So you have sort of three struggles coming together, and that's one of the reasons why it's so explosive, and that's one of the reasons it'll be so difficult to have any resolution which isn't extremely violent.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a lot of loudmouths on the Sunday morning news shows here with all of their solutions for how things ought to be. Maybe carve out a little piece of Syria and declare it free Syria, or create some humanitarian corridor or no-fly zone, even though Assad's not using his planes to bomb people anyway, right? But they're trying to get their camel nose into the tent, one way or the other, and none of them seem to realize the fire they're playing with, or they really don't care. Like you said, if they can weaken Iran, then fine.
Yeah, I think it's that. I think, it's also rather extraordinary. Actually, I don't watch these shows very much because they always irritate me so much. And it's extraordinary the way the bookers for these programs sort of pick people and never ask them, have you ever been to Syria, and everything
right.
like that. They're all produced as though these people had some capital of knowledge. And also how little is sort of learned from Iraq and Afghanistan. If they declare a safe haven or something, this will be considered a declaration of war by the Syrian government, so they'll attack it, Is it a safe haven so the rebels can sort of set up shop there and receive arms supplies there? Will this, so it wouldn't really be a safe haven. It would really be a sort of foreign takeover of part of Syrian territory. All these things lead to more, not less violence.
Right. All right, we got to hold it here and go out to this break. It's the great Patrick Cockburn from the London Independent. That's independent.co.uk. Why War is Marching on the Road to Damascus. You can also find him at alexcobburnscounterpunch.org. We'll be right back after this. All right, y'all. Welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Patrick Cockburn from the Independent. He's the author of Muqtada al-Sadr, and something about the future of the struggle for Iraq. And that's what I want to ask you right now is whether you think that the Al-Qaeda in Iraq guys, the veteran jihadi warriors of the old resistance, from the Iraq War of the last few years are the ones doing the suicide bombings in Syria now?
I think it's probable, yes. I mean, the bombs have been going off in Damascus and Aleppo are exactly the same type of things that we've seen in Baghdad. We saw one today in Baghdad. 18 people were killed, suicide drivers, the target rather carefully selected, vehicles packed full of explosives. Knowing how to do this, having the people who will do it, having the explosives, all these other things, this isn't something that, a bunch of local dissidents in some suburb of Damascus are going to be able to do. So I think it's very much the same guys.
Well, it's funny, we were talking about kind of the media, the juvenile level of their debate about the future of our intervention, the present of our intervention there. The narrative, of course, being what's taking so long to go and be Superman and save the day for the poor Syrian people, that kind of thing. And one of these people on, I believe it was CBS, asked Hillary Clinton what's taking so long, and she was coming up with excuses, and so she happened to mention, I think she probably would, wish she hadn't said this out loud, but she did say, well, Zawahiri's come out and in support of this, and Hamas has come out in support of this. And so are we on the same side as Al-Qaeda in Syria? We need to be very careful, and yet it looks like she's just going to go on anyway. She is going on anyway, right?
Yeah, they sort of, the same sort of entanglements happen. I guess they probably feel that, that they got rid of Gaddafi, but that's a different story from Syria. That at the end, the outcome of that hasn't been too happy. Some militias took over the airport in Tripoli today because they want their leader out of jail. So, but it's in Syria. They sort of sometimes they're overconfident. Sometimes they see the dangers in front of them. But for the Syrian people, this is very bad news because once you have these civil wars that start, even if they begin as popular uprisings, then you have foreign powers with their own very distinct interest using the local groups as pawns. Supplying arms to those who they think are most sympathetic to the interests of the foreign power that is paying them. This is beginning of a whole nightmare for Syria. Now, of course, you have some, in Damascus. I talk to people who say, it'll be a short thing, that Assad will fall, that it may get worse, but, then it'll be all over. It would be good if this did end soon, but I don't see any signs of it. The government is still strong. The opposition has strength, isn't going to go away, but it has all the buildings of, the building blocks of a very bloody stalemate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the way it seemed here, too. I thought that, 3 months ago now, 2.5 months ago, something like that, was the big Battle of Homs, which my understanding was the Syrian government won, and that was a big turning point on the side of the government there. Well,
there was that, yeah, but there was also, that the UN Security Council, didn't, there wasn't a vote in favor of intervention or something like intervention. The government's military superiority shouldn't have been in doubt. Maybe the guys holding Homs, or parts of Homs, thought it was. But, this was always going to be going to end one way. And it still would end one way if there's any sort of military confrontation. But the fighting's getting more intense. The weapons are flowing to the country, paid for by Saudi Arabia and others probably. So, yeah, you have all the ingredients for a very sort of prolonged, nasty, vicious war.
Mm-hmm. You're saying it was always going to go one way. In other words, the only way that there's going to be the fall of the Ba'athist regime there is if there was either a vote on the Security Council for a real war, or NATO goes around them and starts a real war. But foreign powers would have to do it. The people of Syria, you're saying, have no chance, really, against Assad.
Well, probably not against the government as presently constituted. But one of the problems is, you see, at the moment we have the Kofi Annan plan, which is meant to be a ceasefire, which is sort of meant to be applied first on the 12th of April. Obviously, there isn't a ceasefire, but this has elements in it, like allowing popular protest, humanitarian aid, withdrawal of heavy weapons from the city, release of detainees. But it also has as a target overthrowing the government, getting rid of the government. Now, if you want a government to modify its behavior or agree to reforms, you have to give it a reason to do that. If you say, basically, we want you to drop dead, the Syrian government's saying, well, why should we do things that are just geared to weaken us? As for the ceasefire, it's in the government interest, it's not in the rebels' interest to do that. But so I think that there's a sort of hypocrisy about this, and certainly if the Syrian government is meant to be pushed out of power, then it's not going to introduce these reforms.
Right. Now, if it was just, all things being equal and all foreign powers silent for a week or whatever, and it was really just up to the people of Syria, is it about a 50-50 split in support of the regime, or 60-40, or how do you call it?
Things. I think it's, the government, this has been a police state. The guys running at the top, have made a great deal of money. One time this may have been a regime which had popular support, but particularly since they sort of started privatizing industry. It's a bit like Egypt in that way, or Libya. Once they started privatizing industry, pushed by people like the IMF and so forth, what did they privatize public institutions or public companies, and then they were all taken over by the relatives or close friends of Bashar al-Assad or Muammar Gaddafi or the Mubaraks, So they lost support by doing this. And they created a very vicious crony capitalism.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I was talking over you, Patrick. Could you give me your number? Did you say a number you think it is, the split, percentage-wise?
I think that I think the government has support, but maybe it's about 20%. Other people say 30%. One person said to me 30%, but he was a Christian, said 30% for, 30% against. And the other 40% would kind of like to get on with their lives, would kind of like the government to change, but really worried what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. Another, much more militant guy was saying to me, no, it's 5% for the government, another 10% support the government, and then you have 50% who are against the government, and then the rest is on the sidelines. It's a bit it gives an impression of precision about how people are divided. It's really impossible to verify on the ground, or indeed for anybody to know.
Right.
But I think there are people who are going to fight for the government and fight pretty hard. You're going to have, you have the minorities, the Christians, the Alawites, the Druze, the Kurds, and so forth, who worry about what's going to happen if the government falls. Are they going to end up like the Christians of Baghdad, who basically have been destroyed by?
Yeah, all in Syrian refugee camps right now.
Sure, or they've fled. Their communities have been destroyed. They've been there for 2,000 years. So people really worry about that. Then the rebels say, oh no, there are Christians who are against the government and so forth. I think that's true, but I think it's all getting more and more bloody and more sectarian.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, obviously anybody could hate Bashar al-Assad and even want to see him overthrown, but also be very fearful about what might come next.
Yeah, that's true, and then the balance of fear of how much you dislike the present and how much you expect from the future is going to change according to events.
Sure. All right, now, there's been more and more violence in Lebanon, and according, I guess, to McClatchy headlines, which I put some stock in their reporting, they're saying this is really all about what's going on in Syria. Is now breaking out in the suburbs of Beirut. Can you comment on that?
Sure, yeah. It really supports the point I was making of the growing militarization and the growing sectarianism of the Syrian crisis. It's spread to Tripoli. There's a lot of fighting in Tripoli. There's some fighting in Beirut. It's between Alawites and Sunni. In Beirut, Sunni and Shia. this is spreading. This is having an impact in Iraq as well. They don't. That's a Shia government. They don't like what they see. So, this whole crisis has the potential to spread well beyond the borders of Syria.
Now, I don't mean this in a way that it would mitigate their responsibility or anything like that, but I wonder whether you think that the people running the U.S. State Department are just blind, deaf, and stupid, or they really don't care if they set the Levant on fire, or what are they going for here? A permanent war?
I don't really know. I don't know if they know. To a point you demonize Assad, you sort of set things up for a civil war. Iraq and Libya, Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi fell because of outside intervention. In Libya, it was kind of pretend that it was the rebels, but they wouldn't have lasted 48 hours without NATO support. In fact, they were sort of a minor support for NATO, really. If you don't have that in Syria, then the government's going to stay in power. But I think at the moment, what it looks like is a sort of a mix of just enough foreign support to keep the rebels in business and fighting, but the government will stick to it for the moment.
Yeah, well, and then see, that's where we're back to where we started here with the incident. Whether it's this massacre or the next one or some kind of black swan sort of thing comes and becomes the excuse for further intervention. That, now we really just have to do something about it. And, of course, that's the way they always like to pretend they're reluctant.
Always all those who argue for it. It seems to be exactly the same people who argued for intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Right.
It's rather amazing to watch, CNN or watch British television or something, and you see the same old guys, arguing in the same old way that, let's get stuck in there. And never really being held to account for what they did previously or the consequences of what they did previously.
Right, especially on the Iran issue, where all of the worst hawks on Iran were the very worst hawks on Iraq, which was the best thing that anyone ever did for the Ayatollah, was get rid of Saddam for him and help the Shiites take over all the land between Baghdad and Basra, as you describe in your book.
Sure, yeah. And I think that, how far do they think these things through? Well, I don't think they didn't really think things through. Afghanistan, Iraq, what do U.S. administrations think about? Well, I suppose most governments spend most of their time thinking about getting re-elected, So how far do they actually think of the long-term consequence for Afghans, Iranians, Iraqis, Syrians? And I think it's pretty low down in their priorities.
Yeah. All right, well, listen, I've already kept you over time. I better let you go, but I want to thank you very much for your time again on the show, Patrick. Good to talk to you. Everybody, that is the great Patrick Cockburn at The Independent. That's independent.co.uk. The latest is Why War is Marching on the Road to Damascus. We'll be right back.